The year is 1914. A small island with no towns or human settlements, only a lighthouse and a mystery hidden in the depths of the ocean. The film begins with a ship sailing through the South Atlantic Ocean, headed for its destination. David was a weather officer on board. They were heading to an island hidden in the deepest reaches of the Atlantic Ocean. The government had sent David there to observe the island's changing weather. He was to stay there for almost a year, collecting data, understanding the strange weather changes, and then returning. The captain was taking David to the island on his ship, carrying food and all the necessary supplies for a year. After a long journey, they finally reached the island. They landed on a boat and brought their essentials. The island had a lighthouse and a small house where David was to live, as a weather officer had lived there before. But now his time of duty was over. From today, David had become the island's new weather officer, and the old officer, Robert, was about to return home on Captain Axel's ship. But upon entering the house, they were astonished. There was no sign of a human being. The furniture was scattered throughout the room. Everything was in disarray. Perhaps someone might be in the lighthouse. Captain and David wasted no time, heading towards the lighthouse and seeing a strange sight. The entire lighthouse was surrounded by sharp, pointed sticks, as if someone had deliberately locked it to prevent anyone from entering. Captain and David knocked on the lighthouse gate several times, but received no response. Finally, they pushed the gate open and entered. At the very top of the lighthouse, they found a man named Gruner lying there. When they asked Gruner about the old weather officer, he replied nonchalantly, "He's dead. He had some terrible disease." When the captain asked him about the dead body, his answer was even more strange. Perhaps someone had killed him. Both David and the captain were shocked by Gruner's words. They thought Gruner might be mentally unstable, but until they found the old officer, they couldn't do anything. The captain told David, "If you still wanted, you could come back with us." But David knew that if he could provide the government with accurate weather reports from the island, he could earn a lot of money, and he needed money anyway. So he decided to stay. The captain gave him a gun for protection. Perhaps this place wasn't as safe as it seemed. After the captain left, David settled the house a bit, making it habitable. In a drawer in the room, he found a diary belonging to the old officer. That officer had arrived on the island in 1913. The diary contained many details about the island, but not everything was clear. Some details were missing. David read each line carefully. The diary also contained sketches of strange animals. David couldn't understand why he had drawn such pictures. Perhaps he was lonely and doing it to pass the time. One page of the diary also contained a photo of his wife. David grew tired of reading the diary and slowly fell asleep. The next morning, David began his work. But as he reached the sea, his steps stopped. Some stones among the rocks were arranged in strange patterns, and among them were some seashells. The strange pattern made David think that perhaps Gruner had done all this. Thinking this, he returned to his work, collecting weather data, the very thing he had come here for. While working, when he looked through his binoculars towards the lighthouse, he saw another person with Gruner. But then he thought it was just his imagination. It was night, and David was busy with his work when there was a knock on the door. He thought it might be Gruner. David called out his name, but there was no answer. As David stepped forward with the lamp in his hand, strange noises echoed in his ears. Then he saw a strange hand trying to enter from under the gate. It wasn't human. Terror filled David's heart. He immediately ran to the basement and hid. In no time, the mysterious Crutcher had entered the house, stealthily searching for David. Through a small crack in the basement, the Crutcher's terrifying eyes stared at him. David picked up a knife, and as soon as the eyes met the crack, he thrust it in with all his might. The Crutcher screamed and ran away, but it could return at any moment. David closed the basement gate tightly, tied it tightly with a rope, and spent the entire night awake, gripped by terror. The next morning, when David went out, he saw footprints in the sand. The footprints were unmistakable. Were not the work of a human. The footprints ended directly at sea. Now David understood everything. Why had Gruner placed sharp stakes around the lighthouse? Perhaps for that strange creature. And now David knew this house wasn't safe for him at all. Perhaps the creature would return tonight. Terrified, David ran toward the lighthouse. He shouted to Gruner, "Open the gate, I want in." But Gruner wouldn't let him in, saying, "You should have returned with that ship." David returned disappointed. But now he felt his home was safe. He had to make it. He blocked every window in the house with wood. He built a fence with sharp sticks on each side and placed old papers and books outside the gate. He then doused them with oil so that if Crutcher returned, he could be scared away by the fire. But there was one thing David still didn't know, and he would find out tonight. Luckily, he found an old box inside the house. Inside, it was a gun and several bullets. This gave him some courage, but the fear still lingered. As the sun began to set, the darkness of night descended. David sat quietly in a corner of the house, gun in hand. His breathing was heavy. Then a strange sound was heard. And when David stepped toward the window, it felt as if the ground had slipped beneath his feet. Not just one, but several of the same strange creatures appeared from the water, all heading towards his house. Soon, they were trying to break down the gate. David immediately began firing. Some of the creatures fell, but the others became even more violent. They were now trying to get inside the house. As their numbers grew, David wasted no time in setting fire to the papers and old books kept outside the gate. Seeing the fire, the creatures fled back to the sea in fear. But now the same fire had reached David's house. The house was ablaze, and since it was entirely made of wood, the fire spread like lightning. David quickly covered himself with a sheet. He broke through the gate and hid behind a large rock near the lighthouse. His right hand was badly burned. Luckily, it started raining just then. The fire slowly began to die down, but even after a full night of rain, David was unable to save his house by morning. The entire house was almost reduced to ashes. Now, if David wanted to survive, he would have to take shelter in the lighthouse. He picked up his rifle and hid among the rocks near the lighthouse. When Gruner left the lighthouse to fetch water, David followed him. The plan was to take him at gunpoint and force him inside the lighthouse. But suddenly, when Gruner pointed his gun at him, a strange creature nearby attacked him. The creature was Gruner's guard. Gruner immediately stopped David and said, "This is my pet." David didn't fire, but he offered one condition. If he wanted to survive, he should be allowed to stay in the lighthouse. He had enough gunpowder for a year and enough food for both of them. Gruner remained silent for a while, then quietly agreed. Before evening, they returned to the lighthouse with the remaining food. The next morning, the creature was quietly licking David's hand while David was fast asleep, and within a short time, his hand had healed to a large extent. This was a shock to David, but what was happening before his eyes was hard to believe. At the top of the lighthouse, David saw Gruner counting the bullets they had received from the gun, and the creature was also helping Gruner in his own way. This meant that this creature wasn't violent. David now wanted to learn more about it from Gruner and then reveal it to the world, because this was nothing short of a miracle. A strange female creature had appeared before them from the depths of the ocean. If the truth about this creature were revealed, both David and Gruner would become world famous. But Gruner didn't want any of this. He didn't want to leave this island. Gruner had no one of his own. In his opinion, no one can live alone in society. Everyone has to live as a slave or servant to someone. That's why this island was perfect for him. It was a place where he considered himself a king, master of his own will. That's why he had written in several parts of the island, "Gruner is king." But that strange female creature, how did it become his pet? Actually, Gruner had once saved its life. It had accidentally gotten caught in his fishing net. Crutcher was small then, and from that day on, she lived with Gruner. She obeyed everything he said. But Gruner was a short-tempered man and never treated Crutcher humanely. He regularly had physical relations with him. Once, Crutcher even attacked Gruner, and Gruner punished him in return. A punishment that led Crutcher to consider herself Gruner's servant. Perhaps this is why the creatures come out of the sea every night to take her back. But the Crutchers cannot attack in daylight. Well, David doesn't want to stay here anymore. He wants to send a signal to any incoming ship and leave this place. But this task is not so easy. Gruner says no ship comes to this island, but David doesn't believe him. He doesn't like living here at all. He feels suffocated here. He wants to leave as soon as possible. It's getting dark. Gruner tells him to get his gun ready because the Crutchers could attack at any moment. They prepare to turn on the lighthouse's lights. And soon, a large number of the creatures emerge from the sea, heading towards the lighthouse. Gruner continues to fire at them, but David is completely terrified. He retreats into the lighthouse. Despite Gruner's repeated requests, David simply sits quietly in a corner, and soon, David falls unconscious. Gruner continues to fight the Crutchers alone. The next day in the morning, Gruner angrily woke him up and said, "If you want to stay at the lighthouse, you'll have to obey my every command." fetch water daily, perform all the small and large tasks at the lighthouse, and even serve as night guard. Whether David liked it or not, all this had become a compulsion for him. He had to stay at the lighthouse to survive. David was now willing to do all of Gruner's work. But there was one thing he never liked: physically torturing the female creature in various ways every day. But a person living alone on this deserted island for years is bound to have a mental breakdown. David thinks the same thing. Perhaps Gruner's mind is not sound anymore, but he still has to obey. Night falls. They both get ready for guard duty again, and once again the creatures emerge from the sea. But today, David isn't afraid. He fires, but Gruner doesn't do anything. He leaves David outside and closes the lighthouse gate. He sits quietly inside so David can learn how to fight these creatures, or he'll die fighting. David screams for help, but Gruner refuses. The night passes and morning arrives. In the morning, Gruner finds David sitting outside the lighthouse gate, covered in blood. He had now learned how to fight these creatures. His fear had vanished. Time passed like this. Fighting these creatures at night and managing Gruner's lighthouse throughout the day, the island had become like a closed house for him. He constantly wondered when he would leave, when he would be free. Over time, David developed a strange friendship with the female creature. He began to feel bad for her. He understood how difficult it was to be alone, leaving behind one's people. Perhaps the creature felt the same way. David even gave the creature a name, Anarius. And then one day, they noticed that the creature's attacks were gradually decreasing. David thought that perhaps they migrated elsewhere in the winter, like whales does, or perhaps they had realized that fighting them would achieve nothing. But Gruner told him clearly, no way. They would attack again. They were reproducing themselves. Their numbers were increasing. A few more days passed in this manner. One night after dinner, Gruner and David started playing chess to pass the time. But that's where Gruner made a grave mistake. They were so engrossed in the game that they forgot to turn on the lighthouse lights, and the Crutchers, taking advantage of the darkness, attacked them. David realized that the Crutchers had now bred. Their numbers were so great that even two people could not fight for long. The guns had almost run out of bullets. Somehow, they managed to reach the top of the lighthouse. However, Gruner suffered a serious injury to his leg. The Crutchers are trying to break into the lighthouse, and David and Gruner see no way to escape. They give up, but luckily, it's morning. As the sun slowly rises, the creatures leave the lighthouse and retreat to the sea. Anarius tries to heal Gruner's wounds. But by now, David realizes he can't win this battle against these creatures. He's almost out of bullets. He doesn't have enough food to last long. Fortunately, the next day, while David was wandering around outside the lighthouse, he spotted a ship in the sea. He quickly retrieved his flare gun and went to signal the ship. But Gruner stopped him because he didn't want David to leave. At that very moment, Anarius attacked Gruner. She wanted to save David from Gruner. Gruner doesn't want anyone to leave the island. This island is his own world, where he lives like a king. He has a servant who obeys his every word. He doesn't want to leave this life and go back to the city, and he doesn't want to let David go either. After so long alone, he finally had someone to talk to. Slowly, the ship disappeared into the sea before David's eyes. Now he had nothing to do. A few more days passed like this. Gruner continued to treat both David and Anarius badly, but he especially beat Anarius, which David disliked. One day, David gifted Anarius a small toy boat he had made from whale bones. Perhaps it would ease Anarius's mood. But when Anarius saw the boat, she took David to a corner of the island where a real boat was actually kept. When David asked Gruner about the boat, he said yes, he already knew there was a boat on that part of the island. A few months ago, an arms smuggling ship carrying a large amount of ammunition had been there. The ship sank near this island due to a storm. Some people managed to reach the island alive by boat, but before dawn, none of them survived. All fell prey to the creature. Hearing all this, David came up with a plan. He had something like a diving suit. If one of them put on the suit and dived into that part of the ocean, they might find some bullets or dynamite that would make it easier to fight those monsters. But Gruner flatly refused. He didn't even want to go near that sea, but David was willing to do it, even at the risk of his life. A few more days passed like this. A deep connection began to develop between David and Anarius. David was starting to like him. Gruner secretly observed all this, and for the first time, the thought occurred to him that perhaps he should help David. But Gruner's real intentions were different. He wanted David to help him retrieve the boxes of dynamite buried under the sea and then leave him alone in the sea so that the creatures could kill him. This way, the dynamite would also reach him, and Ananias would once again become his slave. They reached the spot. David put on a diving suit and descended into the sea. The ship was completely destroyed, but luckily they found some boxes of dynamite. Then suddenly the creatures appeared. David panicked and fell. The iron diving suit was so heavy that he couldn't even move. He couldn't even send a signal to Gruner. Gruner thought the creatures had killed David, but in reality there were only 2 small children there. David built up pressure underwater and left his diving suit behind. He swam to the surface. He found some old boxes containing dynamite. He laid the dynamite in 2 layers around the lighthouse so that when the next attack came, he could destroy the monsters in one go. A few months passed and the snow started falling. But once again, the creatures disappeared. The attacks had stopped. Now their main job was to run the lighthouse and stand guard as usual. Gruner's patience had run out. Perhaps Ananias had informed the monsters about the dynamite plan. That's why they weren't attacking anymore. Gruner went berserk and started beating Ananias, but David stopped him. Finally, they hatch a plan. Leave the lighthouse's main gate open so that the Crutchers can be blown up with dynamite as soon as they approach. Soon, the Crutchers emerge from the sea. They head straight for the main gate and attack David as soon as he enters. David demonstrates courage and confronts the monsters. As the creatures approach the lighthouse, Gruner presses the dynamite lever, but the explosion doesn't occur. David had disconnected the lighthouse and forgotten to reconnect it. David immediately runs upstairs and begins connecting the dynamite wire. By then, the Crutchers are trying to climb the lighthouse, and only Gruner is trying to stop them. As soon as the connection is complete, David blows up the first layer. Many creatures are destroyed in the blast. However, many monsters are still ready to attack the lighthouse. Because of this, Gruner detonates the second layer as well. Both are knocked unconscious by the devastating explosion. The next morning, when they both woke up, Ananias was gone. Dead creatures were scattered everywhere. Gruner was killing all those who were still alive but injured. Then David noticed a necklace hanging from one of them, and in that moment, he realized his biggest mistake. The creatures he had considered violent were civilized, just like humans. They just couldn't speak. Perhaps their attack on the lighthouse was for a reason. But to Gruner, all this was meaningless. To him, he was the king of the island, and everyone had to obey his orders. After that day, the creatures never attacked like that again. But every day, a wailing sound came from the seashore. David still had no idea the extent of the damage they had caused. How many families were torn apart? How many children had lost their loved ones, all because of a misunderstanding? The next day, David saw some of the creatures' small children in the sea, all those who had lost their families. David made a circle of stones and placed the small toy boat in the middle of it, hopping for Ananias's return. But no matter how long he waited, Ananias never returned. One morning, David found Gruner lying unconscious. Around him were some old things. Among them was an old photograph. As soon as David saw it, he was astonished. The girl whose photo he had seen in Gruner's diary the day before was none other than his wife. Gruner had a wife, and he was the weather officer at the lighthouse, who had arrived on the island about a year earlier. His real name was Robert, but he had changed his name because he never wanted to leave. Seeing all this, David also gave up hope of ever leaving the island. The next evening, when David went to the beach, he saw that the small boat placed in the circle was no longer there. But in the same place, he saw a small child, a crutcher, holding the boat. David threw his flashlight into the middle of the circle to show that he did not intend to fight. He doesn't want to hurt anyone. He wants to be friends with them. Moments later, Ananias emerges from the waves, followed by the entire group of creatures. But this time, no one attacks David because they too want peace. Their only intention was to find a safe place for their children, as every animal does. They are surprised by the sudden presence of humans on the island. They didn't like the entry at all. That's why they attacked every night. But who could explain this to Gruner? He still considered himself the king of this island. Gruner emerged from the lighthouse, gun in hand. David tried to reason with him. These creatures didn't want a fight. They wanted peace. But Gruner wouldn't listen. He yelled at Ananias to go inside. But this was the first time Ananias had disobeyed him, because she was no longer his servant. Now she was just a mother standing up for her children. Gruner felt weak inside because no one was obeying his orders. In anger, he charged towards the lighthouse. David thought perhaps Gruner had now understood that every animal wants freedom. No one wants to live as a slave, but Gruner wasn't a wise man. As soon as he reached the lighthouse, he fired a flare from his signal gun, which struck a small baby creature, killing it instantly. All the creatures fled in fear, and Anarius also lost all trust in David. Enraged, David immediately ran to the lighthouse and confronted Gruner. He began fighting him. "Why did you do all this?" These people only wanted peace. But Gruner had become so violent that he decided to kill David. Just as he was about to strike David with an axe in his hand, David called him by his real name. Hearing this, Gruner stopped immediately. Robert was never that kind of person. His mental state had nearly broken after coming to the island. Loneliness, the death of his wife, and deep depression had all made him that way. He wasn't a killer, he was a good man. Those creatures never wanted to fight. They only wanted peace. Gruner killed them only to show himself powerful, and now Gruner had realized his mistake. So he surrendered himself to those creatures, and within moments they killed him. David locks himself inside the lighthouse. Time passes, and a year later, a government official arrives on the island. A new weather officer is also with him. David was taken away, and the new government official begins monitoring the island's weather. But the official thought David was Gruner, and David didn't correct his misunderstanding. He quietly went to the balcony and stood there without saying a word, because he, just like Gruner, didn't want to leave the island. Meanwhile, Anrius was happy with his family. They no longer feared a man like Gruner. They could live freely on the island and in the sea.